Geopolitics and Empire is joined by Stephen Mosher, who is an internationally recognized authority on China and population issues, as well as an acclaimed author speaker. He has worked tirelessly since 1979 to fight coercive population control programs. In 1979, Stephen was the first American social scientist to visit mainland China, invited there by the Chinese government. Stephen has appeared numerous times before Congress as an expert in world population, China, and human rights abuses. His most recent book is Bully of Asia, Why China's Dream is the New Threat to World Order. I've got the digital copy on my Kindle here. It's great to have you with us, Mr. Mosher.
Well, it's good to be here with you today and talk about these important topics.
Yes, and my biggest concern, as listeners well know, is the totalitarian and technocratic digital dystopia and social credit system that is being thrust upon the West. But before we get to that, perhaps you could give us some context on China, since you have great experience in that respect. And you say that it invented totalitarianism long ago, a sort of early technocracy, as I would call it. It's mentioned in your book as the totalitarian regulation of society in the service of the state, the world's first big brother. And so perhaps if you can give us some background context before we look at what's happening today.
Well, here's what people don't know, but will know after listening to this podcast. And that is that China invented totalitarianism before the birth of Christ, 2,000 years before the birth of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and Karl Marx. Totalitarian was already on the march in China. There was an ancient school of thought called in Chinese Fajia, which means legalism, which argues that all power ought to be concentrated in the hands of the state and that the state ought to be ruled by a single leader. And there's an ancient Chinese saying that just as there cannot be two suns in the sky, so there can only be one emperor. So the first bureaucratic totalitarian regime ever to exist on the planet was actually existing in China over 2,000 years ago. And the reason it came about was this. 3,000 years ago in China, now we're talking about long look back at ancient history, right? 3,000 years ago in China, China was divided into a feudalistic system consisting of literally hundreds of tiny feudal states led by people that we would call in English barons and dukes and counts and so forth. And over time, all of these little dukes and counts and barons, eager to enlarge their own territory, began to make war on each other. And there was a warring states period that lasted literally for hundreds of years in China, from about 700 BC to 200 BC, when China was finally unified under a single leader. And during this course, we had in the West, we had 100 years war. That's a long time to be at war. In China, they had a 500 years war. And at the end of that process, a single state existed covering all of the North China Plain and most of central China, extending out even to the far west. And that single state was the state of Qin, from which we get the word China. And how that single state of Qin came to dominate these hundreds of baronies and dukedoms over time was this. They consolidated all power in the hands of the state. The economy was controlled by the state. The legalists advised, the early totalitarians in China, called the legalists, advised that the state should control the production of iron, because from iron you can make steel and farm implements and control food production and armed conflict. It said that the state should control salt, because salt is a vital element of the human diet and you can't live without it. And so important elements of the economy were already controlled by the state. The legalists also told the ruler of the Qin dynasty that he should set up propaganda teams to control the very thoughts of the people in his realm. And so these propaganda teams went around the countryside singing praises of the emperor and singing praises of the state. This was the first brainwashing. Brainwashing was actually invented in China over 2,000 years ago. The legalists also advised burning the books and killing the scholars who propagated competing ideologies. And so literally hundreds of volumes of ancient books arguing for other forms of social organization, other kinds of statecraft were all burned. You could not keep a book, one of these forbidden books, without being yourself accused of a crime and being beheaded. Confucian scholars, the followers of Confucius and Mencius, the Taoists, all of the other ancient philosophers of China were killed by the hundreds in very, very cruel fashion. So you had, in 2,000 years ago, you had a state ideology. You had it propagated by a massive nationwide brainwashing operation, propaganda operation. You had political commissars in the military to make sure the generals did not get it into their heads that they should replace the emperor. So the political commissars were watching over the behavior of military officers, just as you find in totalitarian regimes today. You had concentration camps invented in China over 2,000 years ago. People were conscripted not just into the army, they were conscripted into great labor projects and sent to work on the Great Wall. That's how the Great Wall was built, by masses of conscripted laborers who lived in concentration camps all their lives. And when they died, their bodies were thrown into the Great Wall, used as kind of human mortar. The great canals of China were also dug in the same fashion. So all of the things that we associate with modern Marxist-Leninism, the idea that you can achieve total control over a population and use it for the purposes of the state and the state's ruler, these were all invented in China by the legalists 2,500 years ago. And China has been a society run in totalitarian fashion ever since. And so when you get to the 20th century, you see the Chinese Communist Party in the early 20s being formed in China. Mao Zedong was one of its early members, not its first founder, but an early joiner of the Communist Party. And what he saw, and the other leaders of China saw in the revolutionary movement, was a Western ideology that basically mimicked what China had invented 2,000 years before. But it had a very modern gloss. It had a scientific gloss. It claimed that this was the latest in Western philosophical thinking, but it had deep, deep resonances in Chinese history. And so naturally, it appealed to them in that fashion as well. And so, in the early days, Chairman Mao, in the 1920s and 30s, in his very early writings, he would often quote Lenin and Marx and Stalin. And then later on, when we get to the late 40s and 50s and 60s, who is he quoting? He's quoting the ancient legalists. He's writing poems about the founder of the Qin dynasty, the first Chinese dragon. He's emulating consciously and vocalizing it, that he's emulating the founder of the Qin dynasty, saying things like the first ruler of the Qin dynasty, the Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, only killed a few hundred Confucian scholars. Mao bragged, I've killed hundreds of thousands of scholars who oppose communism. So communism is really just another way in Chinese parlance of saying ancient bureaucratic totalitarianism that has characterized Chinese governance from the beginning.
A message from our sponsors. The Nomos app will help you survive COVID-1984 and the Great Reset. Nomos is a time bank that can be used by communities anywhere in the world. You just need to talk people into using it. For example, if you go to your barber for a 30-minute haircut, your barber receives 30 minutes in his time bank. He can then use that time to pay for an appointment with the doctor. I've spoken to the developer who is passionate about creating solutions for surviving and thriving in the apocalypse. Nomos is available in both English and Spanish. Hurry and visit nomos.net before they roll out the cashless society and put you in the algorithm ghetto. Also, if you need health insurance that covers you wherever you may roam, check out my friend James Guzman's Borderless Health Insurance. One of the great things about living internationally is saving money on health care, but private care overseas can be expensive. Go to borderlesshealthinsurance.com to watch a short presentation on expat and digital nomad healthcare and sign up for a free consultation to review your options. Geopolitics and Empire needs funding. You can leave a donation book a consultation, or become a member, which gets you access to my brief weekly commentary, a monthly newsletter of my thoughts, a private telegram, a monthly members group call, and my second premium broadcast called Dissident Thinker, where I conduct interviews and provide solo analysis. Dissident Thinker is also available on Rockfin and for supporters on Locals. Yeah, that's a brief snapshot of thousands of years of history, and I recommend people get the book. It's a very easy read, and there's a lot in there, so they can get more of the details. And I did stand on the Great Wall some 15 plus years ago. I was in China. I did a historical tour as a history major, and there are a lot of amazing things to see in China. And you also, it's interesting, you touch on Russia briefly in your book, and I would agree with your assessment. You don't consider Russia as a great threat, and that it just sort of wants to return to some semblance of its Tsarist sort of realpolitik days and just patch together parts of its empire. But you consider today great threats to consist principally of alternative ideologies of civilizational states like China. And so if we get up to speed today, is China, in your view, the principal threat today? And, what is this new old system or organizational emperor what is its system like today? And you also talk about it, China having a superiority complex and so forth.
Well, that's a lot to cover, but let me start with the Great Wall, because everybody knows the Great Wall is the only human construction that you can see from space. But you should remember, and people listening should remember, that when you stood on the Great Wall, you were standing on the bodies of the slaves that had been conscripted 2,000 years ago to build it and kept in concentration camps under the orders of the emperor. So you were standing on a monument to, in a sense, to slavery. The other thing I would say is that a lot of people, when they think of China, they think of Confucianism, and they think of the idea that Confucianism was a model of social control, but it was one that told the people gently that they should see the emperor as a father figure, that younger brothers should respect older brothers, that wives should respect husbands, that students should respect teachers. And there's an impression that the Confucian way of thinking, the Confucian philosophy, was dominant in China. It was never dominant. It was the silken costume that covered the iron scaffolding of totalitarianism. At base, at root, the Chinese system of governance has always been based on bureaucratic totalitarianism, although they cover it with the silken garment in ancient times of Confucianism, which says that the people should kowtow to the emperor of their own accord because he's a godlike deity, he's a father figure, he only has your best interests at heart. And in the same way, they use communism as the silken garb covering the iron scaffolding of bureaucratic totalitarianism, because we know that ultimately communism is not going to lead to the state withering away. It's not going to lead to equality among people. It is just a fantasy. It is a fraud. It is a facade in order to allow a tiny number of people to take absolute power over the rest of the population. That's what communism is. It's just a fraud, in the same way that Confucianism over the centuries was a fraud as well, disguising the totalitarianism that is at root. And as far as Russia is concerned, Russia was Christianized 1,000 years ago by Saint Cyril and Methodius. That's where we get the Cyrillic alphabet. It has been part of the West, aspiring to be part of the West for a millennium, and that process should be allowed to come to completion, because the opposite, though, appears to be happening now. And I don't want to go into that in great depth now. We might talk about that later if we have time. But the opposite, we seem to be driving Russia back into the arms of China. Now, I'm old enough to remember the Sino-Soviet bloc in the 1950s, when Russia, then the Soviet Union, was united by a supposedly common ideology with the People's Republic of China and threatened to dominate the Eurasian landmass. And at the time, we thought it was Russian industry, Russian technology, combined with China's population, that would create a force capable of dominating Eurasia and perhaps wider parts of the world. Now, if we drive Russia completely into the arms of China, you are combining Russia's raw materials, its resources, its oil and natural gas, its wheat, with the huge Chinese population, which lives on a country that is resource poor, and China's industrial base, which needs the raw materials from Russia to function. And again, you created a Eurasian superpower capable of dominating Eurasia and wider parts of the world. That's the worst possible outcome of the current conflict in Ukraine, in my view, is our fusing together inadvertently or somehow deliberately these two powers into a single hostile mass that we will be confronting if it happens for decades in the future. That's a bad outcome.
Yeah, you touched on one of my questions, which was precisely that. In your book, you cite Halford Mackinder, which is often brought up on this podcast, given the title "Geopolitics and Empire." And I want to get your thoughts on, on the Belt and Road, which seems like it's attempting to fulfill Mackinder's prophecy. What do you make of it? Does it really have teeth as it's hyped up to be? Others say that it's not, that it's falling apart in some respects. So do you see the world island, heartland coming together?
Well, that's my fear. That again, if you combine China's industry and population with Russia's raw materials, you have a state capable of dominating not just the world island, but the other continents as well, North and South America and Australia over time. So I think that's a real threat that we're currently facing. Both Russia and China have a lot of vulnerabilities, and so this outcome is by no means preordained. But I think it's the worst possible strategic outcome of our current conflict. There's a lot to talk about in this regard, of course.
Yeah, and another question I had was to look over the past 2+ years, what's been going on. I know you've been commenting on this. Back in January of 2020, I had been the first to interview the author of the Bioweapons Act, Dr. Francis Boyle, on his thoughts regarding coronavirus. His thesis was that coronavirus is an offensive biological warfare weapon that leaked out of the BSL-4 lab in Wuhan. Our interview went viral and was, of course, deleted from YouTube. And then,
of course, it was.
Associated Press wrote a hit piece on us, and I got my Patreon as a result deleted because of that. But my biggest fear over the past 2 years has not been so much the health scare, rather the tyrannical response by all of the world's governments in the form of lockdowns, shutdowns, mandatory medical interventions, what I call COVID-19 84, basically. What's your take on the past 2+ years, everything that we've been experiencing, the pandemic, virus, and so on?
Well, I just wrote a book, which is coming out in July, called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Pandemics. And I mentioned Dr. Francis Boyle's work in that book because I think he's perfectly correct. He's one of the ones who drafted the Biological Weapons Convention some decades ago. He's an attorney by training. I'm actually a biologist. In my former life, I went through a PhD program in biology. And so I was one of the ones who, along with Dr. Boyle, early was saying this is obviously a creation of the lab, probably the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which was doing gain-of-function research. I looked at the backbone of the coronavirus, that is to say, the string of nucleotides that enable it, that is packaged in the little viral envelope and that goes into cells and then replicates itself. If you look at that, it has some very unusual insertions. And it's obviously a product of the lab. It uses a specific technique that is designed in every case to create a virus that is more infectious. And this thing, I believe, was clearly part of a bioweapons program. I have a whole chapter in my forthcoming book about the history of bioweapons research in China and how Chinese military leaders who are in charge of the bioweapons program, like people like Major General Chun, have said openly that China needs to develop bioweapons. The former head of the National Defense University has said openly, and he's a member of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, so no small figure in the Chinese Communist Party's apparatus, said that the new high ground is the development of genetically targeted, ethnically targeted bioweapons. That is to say, bioweapons that target, I don't know, Koreans or Japanese or Vietnamese or Caucasians, but to which the Chinese people are naturally or have a natural or acquired immunity by vaccination. And Major General Chunwei has said things like, before you can develop a sword, before you can develop a shield, rather, I'm translating the Chinese in my mind as I speak, before you can develop the shield, you need a sword. The sword in this case was the virus, SARS-CoV-2, as they call it. I call it the China virus that was developed in the lab. That was the sword, that was the bioweapon. And they were working on a shield when the bioweapon itself, the China virus, got out of the lab. I think in the course of vaccine trials. That part, we don't have the details on because we've been forbidden from going into the lab. And we've been forbidden from having access to the records of the lab. Why? Because they were doing secret bioweapons research. So, we could talk about this at great length. But I wrote about this in the pages of the New York Post in early February. And the same thing happened to me that happened to you. In fact, it happened to the New York Post. They lost their Twitter account. This article, they were blocked on Facebook. Why? Because I had written that it came from the lab and it was created in the lab. And I am absolutely certain, along with Dr. Francis Boyle and everyone else who has since begun to speak out about this, violating Dr. Fauci's rule, of course, Dr. Anthony Fauci, whose basic rule is that if you claim that the virus originated in a lab and that I was doing gain-of-function research there, you'll never get funding from my $6.1 billion annual budget at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Health. He hasn't actually said that, but I'm just speculating that that's the message that has gone out in various ways to virology researchers around the world, all of whom, at least the major ones, all of whom have gotten funding in the past and probably hope to get funding in the future from the NIH. So there's been a cover-up. There has been an attempt by social media to aid the cover-up, and we've seen that in multiple areas now. And I believe that China is right now perfecting a social credit system which will monitor everyone in real time using their computers, using their cell phones, using their automobiles, using any electronic device that they happen to use, and that everyone in real time is being monitored in China by artificial intelligence, and their social credit score goes up or down depending on their behavior. And I believe that the pandemic here in the United States and the West was intended to force you to get the vaccine, that the vaccine in turn was to force you to get the vaccine passport. The passport in turn was to force you to get the social credit score. And the social credit score is to force you to obey the government forever. And the government can then, based on your social credit score, deny you access to, the money in your bank account, food, medicine, housing, travel, you name it. That's what's happening in China right now. And the aspiring totalitarians in the West, who are in politics because they're interested in power, would like to do the same thing here. So in a sense, China, which invented totalitarianism 2,000 years ago, continues to be the model for totalitarians, would-be totalitarians today in the West, who I think are in great social credit score envy of China right now and would like to impose the same thing on us. I do not think, by the way, they will succeed.
Yeah, that was actually my next question. And, just to comment previously, I've interviewed Soviet military physician Igor Shepard, who has the same opinion on you regarding the China the virus and the vaccines. And I just wanted to read a recent tweet of yours where you said internal passports were formerly only used by communist countries. Now everyone is to have one. The implications for freedom are sobering, and that's true. If you look at the Soviet Union, to travel within the Soviet Union, you needed an internal passport. Here in Mexico, which everyone lauds as, the wild, free West, which isn't the case in the state where I am. In January, they initiated vaccine certificates for limited locations, and the governor was discussing requiring a vaccine certificate to enter and exit this one state in Mexico. And so this is insane. And I can't even go back to my homes. I'm a Croatian citizen. I'm an American. My wife is not a U.S. citizen. She has to be vaccinated to enter. So we can't go to the U.S. I refuse to submit to these medical interventions like PCR tests. So that means I can't go back home to Croatia. And there's evidence that the PCR test is to take your DNA. I found Chinese articles in the past where they said precisely that doing these sorts of tests was them getting the DNA to plug into the social credit system, because they need your biometrics, your iris, your blood, your DNA, everything. And just as you said, they're working on these digital passports, which will link to all facets of our lives. And if we don't behave, we saw in Canada, people's bank accounts are being frozen. They're now talking in Canada about outright taking your home, your property, if you protest. And we won't be able to work here where I used to work at the university in Mexico. You can't. One of my former coworkers was fired for not being injected. We can't travel, and we saw in countries like Philippines, you can't even leave your home if you're not vaccinated. And we've seen Justin Trudeau on video praise. He literally said he was praising Chinese dictatorship. And you don't think it's going to succeed? I'm a bit more cynical or pessimistic. I kind of see it advancing. Why don't you think it will succeed?
Well, I don't think it will succeed because of the fact that it is now becoming clear that the only solution to dealing with the COVID pandemic is to recognize that COVID is going to be with us forever, and that we're going to have to deal with it as we deal with the seasonal flu. Now, I think the world always makes a mistake when it emulates China, okay? Because China is kind of the totalitarian state par excellence, right? And I give you an example. China right now is locked down 26 million people in Shanghai, which is its financial center, one of its major industrial centers, its major shipping port. And why have they done that? Because they are still pursuing the fantasy of COVID zero. They still believe that in the totalitarian insanity, they still believe that they can stamp out a highly infectious airborne respiratory virus if they simply impose enough controls on the Chinese people. So what are they doing in Shanghai? Well, they're doing the same thing that the countries of Germany and Austria and Italy and Australia, New Zealand, Western countries, supposedly with Western values, did. They've been locking down people in their homes. They have not been allowing them. In the case of the current lockdown in Shanghai, for example, they've got 26 million people locked inside their apartments, staring at their now empty refrigerators. They can't even go out to buy food. They can't, if they go outside to forage for food, they have to be afraid of being arrested and incarcerated. I just saw one tweet from a foreigner in Shanghai who said this. He said, "It's day 16 of our COVID lockdown in Shanghai, and food is what is on everybody's mind. We aren't allowed to leave home," he says, "so delivery is the only way to get food. I was up at 6 a.m. yesterday trying to get any kind of delivery, but failed. Nothing was available all day. Nothing is available today." Yet the homebound ones are the lucky ones because they're testing everybody, 26 million people, every other day. And if you test positive for COVID, you're sent off to a quarantine camp, which is a concentration camp by another name. On Wednesday, they had 17,000 Shanghainese tested positive. Now, most of them didn't have symptoms, right? Like 95% had no symptoms of COVID. A few hundred did, but they were nonetheless all hauled off to these hastily erected camps, quarantine camps, and children are being taken away from parents. There are, they call them, the police are busy scouring the city streets for anyone who dares to come out and even take a walk or look for food. The Chinese people call the police the big whites. And the reason they call them the big whites is because they're all wearing these head-to-toe hazmat suits, which are white, right? And so the big whites are everywhere. And if they find somebody who's not supposed to be out, they arrest them on the spot. They often beat them, and they take them not to the quarantine camps. They take them to the police station where they're formally arrested and sent to prison camps. So, and there are fights in the quarantine camps over food and water because that's in short supply. As these stories suggest, China continues to unleash another COVID horror story on its population. But the reason I see, back to your question, the reason I see that things are not going to go full totalitarian in this round of the pandemic, at least, is because virtually every person on the planet now recognizes that we're going to simply have to live with the coronavirus from now on, in the same way that we live with the seasonal flu. Even those countries that went into the mass containment model, following China lockstep down the primrose path to total control, even countries like New Zealand and Australia, Germany and Italy are now backing away from this kind of COVID zero fantasy. The German parliament just voted against mandatory vaccines. Australia's leader has said we're simply going to have to live with the coronavirus. So has New Zealand. Now, why is China still pursuing COVID zero? Well, you might say that just like every other political group in the world, they don't want to admit they were wrong, right? In fact, one official in China who was asked recently, why don't we start treating COVID like we treat the annual flu? He said, this was the top official from the National Health Administration in Chinese government. He said, well, if we stop with all the containment measures now, it means that all the previous efforts were for nothing. Well, of course they were for nothing. The virus is going to virus. You can't do anything about it. It's going to spread. But I think there's something else going on here. And I think at a deeper level, I see the Communist Party's insistence on absolute lockdowns, absolute control, as an expression of a larger drive for total control. And I'm reminded, I was in China back in 1980. I was first American social scientist, as you told the audience at the beginning, allowed into China. I spent a year living in a Chinese commune. I had total access. And when the one-child policy began, I was in the operating room while they were forcibly sterilizing and forcibly aborting women, some of whom were at 9 months gestation, almost ready to give birth when their babies were being killed. Why did they do that? Because the head of the Family Planning Association of China, a member of the Communist Party's Politburo, said this. She said, we are a socialist country. We can control reproduction in the same way we control production. We can control it under a state plan. And what do you see today in China? You see Xi Jinping saying the same kind of thing. His attitude seems to be, we're a socialist country. We can control the replication of a highly infectious virus in the same way we control production and reproduction in years past under a state plan. I doubt it. But they're not going to give up their drive for totalitarian control until millions of Chinese people are in the streets screaming at them, saying, we're not going to take it anymore. Now, I think we're past that in the West, at least right now. We see Italy, Germany, Australia, New Zealand backing away from the total COVID control that some of them would have liked to impose upon us. So I think they've lost this round. It doesn't mean they're going to lose the next round. It doesn't mean we don't have to be taking back in the United States the U.S. Congress and putting a president who respects the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in this country. And people in other countries should be doing the same thing. They'll be back. The totalitarians will be back. And their model continues to be the People's Republic of China. Make no mistake about that.
You remind me of a past guest I've spoken to, Gregory Copley, who's got a book called New Total War, and he talks about how we are in this new total war with China, and it encompasses information warfare, biowarfare, all kinds of stuff. Things are heating up. Many analysts I speak to think China will go for Taiwan and that this will be the war trigger. I, in some ways, think war is inevitable. You also talk about China's build-up to war through various means. What's your take on the future from here on out? Are we in danger of a World War III with China?
Well, I mean, we're in danger of World War III right now because we have the current occupant of the White House making wild remarks about the current leader of Russia. I'm not a fan of Vladimir Putin, who is, but to call him in the middle of a conflict a war criminal with the suggestion that somehow one day we're going to destroy the Russian army and government and arrest Putin and his cohort and put them on trial is a very dangerous thing to be saying. I also, take issue with his recent statement. President Joe Biden, who apparently thinks he's still vice president, he said that the Ukraine-Russian war was going to give birth to a, quote, new world order, and that the U.S. was going to lead it. Well, he's certainly right that if we handle this conflict wrong, there's going to be a new world order. But the United States is not going to lead it. That China, with Russia as a kind of tributary state, is going to lead it. We have this collective rush to impose economic sanctions, and we seem to be destroying the existing world order in the process. In trying to punish the oligarchs in Russia who support Putin, we are undermining, respect for contracts. We're undermining the rule of law. We're undermining our own banking system. We're undermining the protection of private property. We're undermining the current world order in multiple ways. And at the end of the day, if we destroy the current world order in the process of trying to destroy Vladimir Putin, we will wind up the worst because, for the last 50 years, since the Nixon overture to China, Nixon went to China in 1972, it's been U.S. policy to drive a wedge between the two Eurasian giants, right? The whole idea of playing the China card was to wrest China away from any sort of alliance of convenience, pseudo-alliance or military alliance with the Soviet Union. And it succeeded. Now, I'm not a great fan of Henry Kissinger, but nonetheless, we have succeeded in the last 50 years in keeping the two Eurasian giants apart from reforging the Sino-Soviet bloc. And now we seem to be moving in the other direction. We seem to be leaving Putin with very little choice but to move down that road. And you saw that at the beginning of the Ukraine invasion, where China and Russia signed a 5,000-word document, probably negotiated, 5,000-word documents do not get negotiated overnight. This was months in the making. China, I believe, encouraged Vladimir Putin to go into Ukraine as kind of a test case to see how the West would react if a country decided to try to recover some of its lost territory. It was kind of a model for the future effort by the People's Republic of China to send an armada across the 90-mile-wide Taiwan Straits, do an amphibious invasion, and take back what they considered to be the lost province of Taiwan. So that's why they encouraged Putin to go into Ukraine to see the Western response. They probably thought far enough ahead because these people have a 100-year plan. They're not just thinking about the next election or the next opinion poll, which I'm afraid the people in the White House now are thinking about, and no further. They're thinking about decades to come. And they're also thinking if the Western sanctions are severe enough to drive Putin into our arms, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. So instead of peeling Russia away from China's orbit, of course, we're forcing Russia to embrace China. And China is there welcoming with open arms. Now, I have to say this about Taiwan. People need to understand that Taiwan has never been ruled from Beijing over the course of over a century now. Taiwan was part of a late addition to the Qing dynasty, which you remember was not a Chinese dynasty at all. It was a Manchu dynasty. The Manchus came over the Great Wall and took over, destroyed the Ming dynasty, which was a Han Chinese dynasty, and replaced it. The horse archers from the north, as they did fairly frequently, came over the Great Wall and dominated China. And it was during that period of time that the fleeing remnants of the Ming dynasty fled across the Taiwan Straits to the island of Taiwan. So that didn't start, the population, the Han Chinese didn't start coming over to Taiwan until the fall of the Ming dynasty in 1640, 1642. That's when the Chinese settlement of Taiwan began. There's a large Aboriginal population on Taiwan who are related to the Filipinos, all right? So it was part of the Qing dynasty, but when the Qing dynasty lost a war to Japan in 1895, there was a war over Korea, as you know, being a historian, and as a result of the Sino-Japanese War of 1895, Korea became a Japanese colony, and so did Taiwan. Taiwan became a Japanese colony. But a strange thing happened. While the Koreans literally, and I don't use this word lightly, hate the Japanese for the brutal colonization of their country, Japan, for some reason, treated Taiwan very differently. The Taiwanese people, half Aborigine and half fleeing from the Manchu dynasty, did not fight for very long against the Japanese who came in. The Japanese set up schools, they built hospitals, they started industry in Taiwan. And over time, over the next few decades, the idea was that Taiwan would become the southernmost island in the Japanese island chain, stretching down from Honshu through Kyushu, the big southern island, down through the Ryukyus, Okinawa, and then winding up with Taiwan at the bottom of that island chain. The nearest Japanese island, by the way, in Ryukyus, is only about 70 miles away from Taiwan. So if you talk to the Taiwanese, as I did in my first research in Taiwan back in 1976, 1977, the Taiwanese all spoke Japanese. I do too, so I was able to conduct some of my interviews with older Taiwanese in Japanese. They had fond memories of the period of Japanese occupation, believe it or not. And that went on until the war ended in 1945. And Japan was given not to the People's Republic of China, which did not exist. Taiwan was given not to the People's Republic of China, which did not exist. It was given to the Republic of China, which sent over a governor and an army. And when the mainland fell, of course, Chiang Kai-shek came over with a couple million, part of his army, of course, but a lot of people from coastal China, from Shanghai, from Guangdong, fled to Taiwan. Many of them were Christians. They were fleeing the advancing communists. So Taiwan has never been under communist rule. And today, if you ask the Taiwanese, 77%, over three quarters of the population of the island, say that they would take up arms to defend their freedom if China invaded. And I lived in Taiwan in the 70s and 80s. I lived in Taiwan under the last years of Chiang Kai-shek. After he died, his son, Chiang Ching-kuo, took over the presidency. But then an interesting thing happened. His vice president was Lee Dong-hui, who was Taiwanese, educated in Taiwan and in Japan, spoke better Japanese, really, than he did Mandarin. And he led the way in the early 1990s to the first free and fair elections in Taiwan. And there have been 5, I think, free and fair elections in Taiwan for the presidency that have taken place since its full democratization. So Taiwan has passed with flying colors the final acid test of a democracy. There has been a peaceful transition of power from one political party to another, from the Minjindan, the Democratic Progressive Party, to the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, back to the Democratic Progressive Party, and we're in the hands of the Democratic Progressive Party today under the current president. So Taiwan is a full-fledged democracy that respects human rights and is a sovereign state and should be recognized as such by the United States of America. The greatest blunder in the opening to China was the fact that we did not insist on continuing to recognize the Republic of China on Taiwan. Had we done so, we would have diplomatic relations both with Taiwan and with the People's Republic of China, and so would dozens and dozens of other countries. We would be in the same situation vis-a-vis the two Chinas that we were in regard to the two Germanys, where we had diplomatic recognition, not just with West Germany, but from 1984 on, I believe, with East Germany as well. That would have helped to guarantee peace across the Taiwan Straits. Right now, of course, we face the threat of war. And it's a threat that the Chinese communist leaders make constantly. And they make it every time they send an airplane into Taiwan's air identification zone, which they do almost on a daily basis. They send fighters and bombers into Taiwan's airspace. They do it every time they threaten to use military force to take back Taiwan if Taiwan doesn't simply surrender. Well, Taiwan's not going to surrender, and it's not in our interest that they surrender. But it is in our interest to treat Taiwan very differently from Ukraine. You see, because the Biden administration was withholding weapons from Ukraine and only began to provide weapons after the invasion occurred. We have to do the opposite with regard to Taiwan. We have to arm Taiwan to the teeth now, so that Taiwan kind of adopts a porcupine strategy. Sure, China's a lot bigger. It has a large navy. It's developing a marine landing force. The Chinese People's Liberation Army Marines have tens of thousands of Marines in training. But if Taiwan has the ability to stop an invading fleet from crossing the Taiwan Straits, that invasion will never occur. But we have to arm them now. They can afford to pay for it. They're a developed country with a per capita income, I think, of about $25,000 a year. They can afford to pay for these advanced weapon systems. We should not refuse to supply them with weapons for fear of offending Beijing. Because once again, here is where peace through strength will demonstrate once again that the way to preserve the peace, as the ancient Romans said, was to prepare for war. We're supposed to send, for example, 100 Harpoon anti-ship missiles to Taiwan. The sale has already been approved. The missiles aren't due to get there until 2025. They should get there tomorrow. Those would be a very effective weapon against any invading fleet. So we can forestall a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And we should, not by getting American troops involved, but by providing Taiwan with the defensive weapons it needs now that it can use to defend itself.
Do you have any final thought for us, recommendations? What do we do? How do we, as individuals or as nations, survive this tyranny, whether it's the social credit score or nuclear war? I mean, I'm in contact with people messaging me, consulting with me, who are, some people are running for the hills in different countries, even fleeing here to Mexico. Any final thoughts for us?
Well, I do think that we're on the edge of a precipice here in the United States and in a sense around the whole world. That there are several threats that are simultaneously threatening our future. One of those threats, of course, was the threat that China would unleash a highly infectious, deadly virus on the world, to which it had immunized its own people against. Well, that threat didn't materialize because I think the genie got out of the bottle, the virus got out of the lab before they had a defense against it, and they suffered along with the rest of the world. So that threat, I think, is receding, but we have to remain alert because if Vladimir Ilyich Lenin is said apocryphally to have said on one occasion that the quickest way to dominate a population, dominate the masses, is through the healthcare system. I don't know whether that's an accurate quote or not. I can't find it in his collected works, but it certainly is true that by scaring people with the thought that they were going to die from a deadly disease, the totalitarians, the would-be totalitarians, released their secret Nazis and sought to seize total control over us in the name for our own good. Of course, it's always for our own good. So that's one threat. I think that threat is receding, but we have to be alert. We have to put protections in place so this never happens again. We should never abandon all of our common understanding of natural immunity and all of the public health measures that we were supposed to be taking to stop infectious diseases in favor of adopting what? A model from totalitarian China. That's insanity. And then we have the threat from China itself. We must prevent Russia from becoming part of a new China-Russia bloc that would give China access to the resources it needs to dominate the world. And finally, we have to take back control in the United States of our own system of government here, because too many people in high office regard themselves more as citizens of the world or globalists. Too many people in the social media are interested more in the kind of control that social media gives them than in the founding principles of the United States. We cannot allow them to hack our brains, because hacking is even more dangerous than brainwashing. Brainwashing was invented by the Chinese Communist Party in the 1930s, but you knew you were being brainwashed when you were arrested, sent to a concentration camp, and forced to listen to morning to night lectures, sometimes interrupted by torture sessions. You knew you were being brainwashed. So your free will was not completely destroyed. But through hacking, by controlling social media, by controlling what people see, what news they're allowed to see, what opinions they're allowed to reflect upon, you can actually hack the human brain. You can destroy people's free will without their knowing that it's being destroyed. We have to stop the threat from social media by breaking up these monopolies and allowing the kind of free exchange that you and I have here today been able to engage in.
Yes, I would agree. And finally, what would be what's the best website for people to follow you? And are there any other projects and books that we should know about?
Well, the books we've talked about, Bully of Asia is out in a new expanded edition as of last month. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in the past and present threat from China and the future threat from China, get a copy of that. My book on the pandemic, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Pandemics, will be out in a few weeks. We've made every mistake in the book in dealing with this pandemic, every mistake. And finally, our website is pop.org, pop, P-O-P.org. POP is short for Population Research Institute. And we have a lot of material on China and other issues on that website as well. The world is not overpopulated. As Elon Musk recently said, our long-term problem is not too many people, but too few people. And if we have too few people, he said, civilization will collapse.
Yeah, I would agree. I just realized that, when I was teaching, when I was still teaching previously, I would always use that one popular video from Population Research Institute, which describes how we are not overpopulated and everyone fits in the state of Texas. And if you just travel, I've lived in half a dozen countries. You travel throughout the countries, it's mostly empty. People just want to live in urban areas. Just if you live in the rural area, there's no problem. There's plenty of space on the planet. And anyways, everyone be sure to check out Stephen Mosher's book, Bully of Asia, and the one that's upcoming. Follow him on Twitter. Go to the website, pop.org. And again, thank you for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Well, thank you for what you do.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list that goes out with each podcast and every weekend with a collection of news headlines. The newsletter and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's nearly impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently takes down our videos with strikes. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit and Twitter take down posts. And after the Associated Press mentioned geopolitics and empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account. The best free way to help geopolitics and empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the podcast ecosystem: SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Finally, Geopolitics and Empire is in dire need of funding to continue. You can leave a donation, purchase a consultation with the host, or become a member to receive additional benefits. We also produce a weekly broadcast called Dissident Thinker for members and Rockfin subscribers only. We will continue to fight the good fight come hell or high water. Thank you for listening.